London, 1818, a city of glittering wealth and silent cruelties, where reputation was as fragile as glass and hearts were too often bartered for titles. Beneath chandeliers burning like captive stars, the season's grandest ball unfolded within the gilded halls of Somerset House. Carriages lined the square, their wheels slick with rain, and the air inside shimmered with perfume, ambition, and the rustle of silk. It was here that Lady Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of a room that was not made for her. At 28, she was considered past the age of romantic promise, though her beauty, refined, luminous, untouched by vanity, drew eyes even from those who whispered behind their fans. An orphan of noble birth but dwindling fortune, Clara had lived between worlds, too well-bred to fade into obscurity, yet too poor to be welcomed as an equal among those who measured worth by inheritance and dowry. Still, she carried herself with that most dangerous of qualities, quiet dignity. The orchestra played a waltz. Laughter rippled like crystal across the room. Clara, standing beneath a marble column, clutched the edge of her fan and tried to ignore the murmurs that floated toward her. She's here alone again? They say the Crown is arranging her marriage to the Duke of Ashborne. A pity. He'll never have her. The man is pride itself. Their words were daggers she had learned not to flinch from. For weeks, rumors had swirled of a royal decree, that His Grace, Alexander Ravenswood, Duke of Ashbourne, was to marry her in order to settle a dispute between their estates. It was the kind of political union common in their world, where duty wore the mask of destiny. But the gossip carried one more cutting edge. The Duke had made it known that he found the arrangement intolerable. And tonight, she would meet him for the first time. The crowd parted slightly as he entered, tall, broad-shouldered, the embodiment of the English aristocrat. His dark hair was impeccably combed, his eyes cold and sharp as steel. He carried himself with the stillness of a man unaccustomed to being refused anything. Even in silence, Alexander Ravenswood drew attention the way a storm gathers light. Clara watched him approach the Queen's dais, bowing with measured grace. When his gaze swept across the ballroom, it paused briefly, too briefly, upon her. The Queen's voice carried above the hush. "Your Grace, Lady Clara Whitmore." The introduction was meant to seal civility upon a royal decision. The Duke stepped forward, his expression impassive. Clara curtsied, her eyes lowered, the faintest tremor in her hands. For a heartbeat, all London seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice calm and merciless, the Duke said, "Your Majesty, with all due respect, if this lady were the last woman on this earth, I would not marry her." The words fell like a blade across the marble floor. The Queen's smile faltered. A murmur swept through the ballroom, shock, delight, pity, each emotion more poisonous than the last. Clara's breath caught, though she did not lift her eyes. Her heart pounded painfully, but her posture did not waver. The Duke bowed again, as though his insult were merely a statement of fact, and turned away. The orchestra faltered, then recovered, the waltz continuing as if nothing had happened. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. Where once there had been idle curiosity, now there was hunger. Every glance in the room turned toward Clara, waiting for her to break. She did not. She rose from her curtsy, met the Queen's gaze, and spoke in a voice so calm it silenced the whispers nearest her. "Your Majesty, it appears His Grace and I are in agreement about very little." She dipped her head with flawless composure and stepped back into the crowd, her dignity the only weapon left to her. Behind her, gossip bloomed like ivy. By the time the carriages rolled into the night, the tale had already begun to twist through London, the proud Duke's cruel rejection of the orphaned lady. Some pitied her. Others laughed. But a few, the perceptive few, had seen the flicker in the Duke's expression as he turned away. There had been something there, a hesitation almost invisible, as if the man himself were startled by the words he had spoken. Rain fell softly on the cobblestones as Clara's carriage jolted away from Somerset House. She sat in silence, watching the city lights blur against the wet glass. Her heart ached, but she refused to let tears fall. A lady, she reminded herself, must never grant her enemies the satisfaction of her grief. Yet beneath her composure, humiliation burned, not for the rejection itself, but for the knowledge that her life, once quietly her own, had now become the entertainment of others. Back at her modest townhouse, the fire had nearly died. She removed her gloves, one finger at a time, her movements deliberate, disciplined. Pride, she told herself, was not the absence of pain, it was the refusal to be destroyed by it. Still, when she looked into the mirror, she barely recognized the calm woman staring back. Across the city, in the grand chambers of Ashbourne House, the Duke paced before his hearth. His valet had long since retired, but Alexander could not rest. His words replayed in his mind, each one colder than he had intended. He had meant to end the rumors, to make his stance clear to the court, yet something in her eyes, the quiet steadiness with which she had endured his cruelty, had unsettled him. He had expected tears or outrage. Instead, she had given him silence, and somehow that silence pursued him more than any outcry could have. He poured a glass of brandy but did not drink it. Pride was a heavy crown, one he had worn all his life. His father's voice still haunted him, a man who believed emotion was weakness, affection a liability. The Duke of Ashbourne had sworn never to be ruled by either. And yet, as the rain struck the windows, he found himself remembering the calm defiance of a woman who had every reason to hate him. By morning, London was alive with rumor. The Queen, unamused by his defiance, issued a second decree, firmer, final. For the peace of the crown and the unity of two ancient estates, the marriage would proceed regardless of personal objection. The Duke received the order with a clenched jaw. Clara received it with a bowed head. Fate, it seemed, would not be denied. When next their paths crossed, weeks later, at the quiet signing of documents before the royal solicitor, neither spoke more than duty required. He offered no apology, and she expected none. The ink dried between them, binding their futures with the same precision that had divided their hearts. As Clara stepped into the carriage that would carry her to her new home at Ashbourne Hall, she looked once through the window at the city behind her, the world that had mocked her, the world she would now leave behind. He thought he had won his defiance. The narrator would murmur, if such a voice could be heard in that moment. But he had, in truth, met his destiny. And with that, the wheels turned through the rain, carrying both pride and fate toward their reckoning. Ashbourne Hall stood upon the northern moors like a relic of a sterner age, vast, solemn, and proud. The carriage bearing Clara Ravenswood, now Duchess of Ashbourne, approached through a corridor of oak trees blackened by winter. The estate's grandeur might have awed another woman. But to Clara it felt more like a fortress than a home. The sky was iron gray, and the wind carried a whispering chill that matched the silence of her heart. Inside, servants lined the entrance hall, bowing as she entered, respectful, curious, and faintly uncertain of this new mistress whom their duke had not chosen. Alexander Ravenswood greeted her not with warmth, but with courtesy honed to precision. "Her Grace will be shown to the east wing," he told the butler, his gaze skimming past her as though she were a figure in a portrait. The words stung, though she betrayed nothing. Clara curtsied slightly in acknowledgment, her composure unbroken, even as the distance between them felt colder than the winter air. Days settled into a routine of civility. They dined together out of obligation, exchanging polite remarks over candlelight that neither of them tasted nor felt. When he spoke, it was of estate matters, repairs, rents, political correspondence. Clara replied with measured attentiveness, knowing she must not appear ignorant, yet careful not to intrude upon his pride. They existed as two finely carved statues, graceful, perfect in posture, and utterly lifeless. In those early weeks, the Duke's demeanor baffled the household. He was not cruel. Cruelty at least would have been passion of a kind. Instead, he was distant, as though perpetually elsewhere. His conversation restrained, his eyes unreadable. To Clara, his silence became both armor and mirror. It revealed how alone she truly was. Yet she refused to yield to bitterness. There was work to be done. Ashbourne's tenants, worn by harsh winters and poor harvests, had long been neglected by London's indifferent nobility. Clara began to visit the cottages, bringing medicines and woolens, learning the rhythm of the people's lives. The villagers, wary at first, grew to respect her quiet kindness. Whispers drifted through the servants' halls, the Duchess walking among the poor, the Duchess reading to the children in the parish schoolroom. These whispers, like threads of light, reached the Duke himself. He did not speak of it, but one evening, as he reviewed accounts in his study, he paused over a report mentioning her name. His steward had written of improved morale among the tenants, of how the Duchess had convinced the local physician to remain in the district. Alexander frowned, tracing her signature at the bottom of a letter. Her handwriting was elegant but firm, the hand of a woman who acted not for admiration, but for purpose. He set the paper aside and poured another glass of brandy, unsettled by the faint stirring of something he could not name. Yet London's society was not as forgiving as the countryside. By spring, the gossip that had begun with their engagement found new life. Letters arrived from acquaintances in the capital, some pretending sympathy, others veiling curiosity with malice. It was said that the Duke's marriage was one of convenience, that the Duchess was his charity, that he seldom appeared beside her in public. Clara learned of these whispers not from him, but from a visiting cousin who repeated them with theatrical sorrow. She smiled faintly and changed the subject. But that night, when she passed the long corridor of ancestral portraits, she felt each painted gaze judge her anew, a lineage she had married into but not yet earned. It was soon after this that she stumbled upon the small, dust-laden music room at the far end of the east wing. The piano there had not been touched in years. Its cover was faded, its ivory keys dulled with neglect. Clara lifted the lid and pressed a tentative note, a sound thin and trembling, yet alive. From that day forward, she returned each evening when the household slept, her hands coaxing melodies from the instrument until music once again filled the forgotten corners of the house. It was during one of these secret vigils that the Duke found her. He had come to the east wing seeking a misplaced volume, and the faint sound of music drew him nearer. Standing unseen in the doorway, Alexander watched her, the soft lamplight catching the curve of her neck, the deliberate grace of her fingers upon the keys. There was no vanity in her playing, no artifice, only sincerity. When the last note faded, he spoke quietly, his voice breaking the stillness. I did not know the piano still sang. Startled, she rose, curtsying instinctively. Forgive me, Your Grace. I thought the room forgotten. He shook his head slightly. No, madam. It was I who forgot. His gaze lingered, not bold, but uncertain, as if he were confronting an emotion long dismissed. Yet before it could deepen, he inclined his head and withdrew, leaving her with a ghost of unspoken apology. In the days that followed, something imperceptible shifted. He no longer avoided her company quite so pointedly. At breakfast, he asked after her walks. At dinner, he listened when she spoke of the tenants or the estate gardens. Their exchanges remained formal, but a quiet respect began to take root between them, fragile, tentative, like the first shoots of spring. Then came the matter of the locket. While overseeing the cleaning of an attic chamber, Clara discovered a delicate gold pendant, its chain broken, the portrait within faded almost to nothing. When she inquired, an elderly maid revealed it had belonged to the late Duchess, Alexander's mother, who had died when he was a child. The piece had been lost for years. Clara said nothing more, but that evening she sent it to a jeweler in York to be repaired. Weeks later, she left it upon his desk without note or signature. He found it late at night, the firelight glinting off its polished surface. Opening it, he saw the restored miniature, his mother's face, now bright again against the gold. The gesture pierced through him more sharply than any reproach could have. For a long while, he sat motionless, the weight of the locket in his hand heavy as memory. The following morning, he entered the breakfast room earlier than usual. Clara looked up, surprised. He said nothing at first, then placed the locket gently upon the table between them. You had this repaired. She inclined her head. It seemed a pity to let it remain broken. He studied her for a moment, searching for vanity, for pretense, finding neither. Thank you, he said simply, the words quiet but sincere. It was the first warmth she had ever heard in his voice. That afternoon, as word spread of a visiting countess arriving at the neighboring estate, London's gossip found new fuel. Rumors bloomed that the lady and the Duke had once shared a closeness too improper for conversation. The servants whispered, the tenants speculated. Clara remained composed, even when the Countess arrived uninvited at Ashbourne Hall 2 days later, smiling with practiced sweetness. In the drawing-room, under the gaze of half the household, the Countess remarked with false concern, "My dear Duchess, it must be strange to live where affection is so selectively bestowed." The implication was venomous, designed to wound. Before Clara could reply, Alexander rose from his chair, his voice cool but cutting. "You presume much, madam. My wife's place in this house, and in my regard, is not a subject for your amusement." The silence that followed was absolute. The Countess flushed, murmured some brittle apology, and excused herself. Clara, stunned by his defense, found her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. When the door closed, he turned to her. Their eyes met for the briefest instant, his gaze steady, hers uncertain, and for the first time since their wedding, something unspoken passed between them. Respect, perhaps, or the faintest tremor of understanding. That night, as she prepared for bed, Clara lingered by the window overlooking the darkened gardens. The wind had softened, and the first buds of spring glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Somewhere beyond the walls, the distant song of a nightingale trembled in the air, a promise, fragile yet alive. And though neither would yet name it, something within the cold halls of Ashbourne had begun to thaw. Winter came early to Ashbourne that year, settling upon the moors like a great white silence. The air grew sharp, the sky pale and endless, and the hearths burned day and night. Yet even as frost jeweled the windows and the fields lay buried under snow, Clara felt an unfamiliar warmth beginning to bloom in her heart, a warmth born not of fire, but of fragile understanding. The Duke had changed. Subtly, cautiously, he began to seek her company. Their conversations at dinner stretched beyond courtesy. His gaze, once so guarded, softened when it met hers. She noticed how he lingered near the library where she often read, how his laughter, rare and restrained, emerged in the smallest of moments. The servants whispered of harmony returning to the house, but Clara did not dare to believe it. She had learned that hope could wound more deeply than scorn. Then, in the first week of December, a sudden fever seized him. What began as a chill after a hunt grew swiftly into a raging illness. The physicians were summoned from York, their expressions grim. Within days, the Duke could no longer rise from bed. His strength, once formidable, was stripped away by delirium and weakness. Ashbourne fell into fearful quiet. The servants moved like ghosts, and word spread through the estate that their master might not see Christmas. Clara did not leave his side. Hour after hour, she sat by the bed, bathing his forehead, whispering his name through his restless dreams. His fevered murmurs pierced her, fragments of apology, half-formed pleas for forgiveness, names from the past spoken with pain. Once, in the stillness before dawn, he grasped her wrist, his eyes half open yet unseeing, and whispered, "Do not leave me." The words trembled from him like the confession of a man who had never known how to ask for kindness. Her throat tightened. "I will not," she whispered back, though she knew he could not hear her. The days blurred into one another. Long, sleepless, hushed. Outside, snow fell without sound. Inside, Clara's world had shrunk to the rhythm of his breathing, the glow of the fire, and the quiet ticking of the clock that marked each uncertain hour. She spoke little, even to the doctors. Their prognosis shifted with each sunrise, one morning hopeful, the next despairing. When they urged her to rest, she refused. "I shall rest when he does," she said simply, and none dared to argue. In the solitude of those nights, she began to see him not as the distant Duke, but as a man stripped of all armor, flawed, frightened, human. She noticed the way his brow furrowed even in sleep, as if burdened by the ghosts of his lineage, the way his hands, once commanding, now trembled when he reached for hers. He had been raised to believe compassion was weakness, yet it was compassion now that kept him alive. On the 12th night, when the fever reached its cruelest height, Clara felt the fragile line between endurance and despair begin to blur. She prayed aloud, voice trembling, "If he must suffer for his pride, let it be enough. Spare him now." The wind moaned through the chimneys, and for a moment she thought her plea had been swallowed by the storm. But just before dawn, the fever broke. His breathing eased, slow and steady, and a faint color returned to his cheeks. Exhausted, she sank to her knees beside the bed, her hands trembling in silent relief. When Alexander finally opened his eyes, it was as though weeks had vanished. He looked about the room with confusion, then found her beside him. Clara, pale from sleeplessness, smiled faintly. "You are safe now," she said softly. His gaze held hers, dazed, searching, almost fearful. "You have been here all this time?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice was quiet, but steady. "You were not alone." He swallowed hard, his composure fracturing. "I remember your voice. I thought it was a dream. It was not." Something in his expression broke, the wall of pride that had shielded him for years. "Clara," he said, her name foreign on his tongue yet spoken with reverence. "I wronged you from the moment we met." She shook her head, but he reached for her hand, his grasp weak but insistent. "No. I was cruel because I was afraid of needing anyone. You gave what I did not deserve." His voice faltered, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw tears in his eyes. Clara's own vision blurred. "You do not owe me gratitude," she whispered. "Only honesty." He gave a faint, broken smile. "Then I shall be honest. I do not remember a world without control, yet now I would surrender all of it if it meant keeping you here." The confession hung between them, raw and fragile. She felt her heart tremble with something perilously close to joy, yet she knew better than to trust a man still half in the grasp of recovery. Gently, she withdrew her hand. "Rest now, my lord. We shall speak when you are stronger." He closed his eyes, not in dismissal, but in peace. She watched him drift into sleep, her chest tight with emotion she could not name. Over the next week, his strength returned slowly. The color in his face deepened. The sharpness returned to his voice, though it carried a new gentleness when he addressed her. She noticed the difference in small things, the way he thanked her, the way he watched her as though seeing her for the first time. When he was able to walk again, she found him one morning in the conservatory, standing among the frost-touched roses. He turned as she entered. "I owe my life to you," he said quietly. "You owe it to your will to live," she replied, smiling faintly. He studied her, as though searching for the woman he had once dismissed. "You are not what I imagined," he said at last. "Few people are," she answered. There was a pause, not awkward, but weighted with meaning. He took a breath, steadying himself. "I have spent years mistaking pride for strength," he said. "And yet it was your kindness that saved me. Tell me, how does one repay such a debt?" She looked toward the garden, where sunlight melted the last of the snow. "By living better than before." He nodded, his jaw tightening as if to hold back emotion. "Then that is what I shall do." As she turned to leave, he called softly, "Clara." She stopped, and he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "How cruelly I misjudged you." She met his gaze, steady, unafraid. "We both misjudged something, Your Grace. Time will tell what remains." That evening, as she retired, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The house no longer felt cold. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that the man she had married might one day become the partner she had longed for. Outside, the snow ceased. Dawn crept gently over Ashbourne, gilding the frozen world in light. And in that fragile stillness, something unspoken took root. The beginning of love, quiet as breath, certain as morning. Spring returned to Ashbourne with the gentlest of awakenings, snow melting into silver streams, the air sweetened with wild violets, and the once dormant estate stirring back to life. The chill that had lingered for months seemed to lift from its stone walls, replaced by a warmth that mirrored the slow transformation within its master's heart. The Duke, though outwardly unchanged in bearing, carried himself with a quiet humility that had never been there before. His voice, once sharp and distant, now held a note of thoughtfulness, and his gaze softened whenever it fell upon Clara. She noticed it in the smallest gestures, the way he paused to open a door for her, how he lingered at breakfast to ask about her plans for the day, how he listened when she spoke of the estate or the tenants. Yet, for all his attentions, there remained a careful distance, a reverence almost, as though he feared that to touch what he now cherished might break it. Clara, in turn, met this gentleness with cautious grace. She had learned that affection born of gratitude could fade as swiftly as it bloomed, and she would not surrender her heart until she was certain his had truly changed. Their marriage, once a formality, had grown into a delicate dance of mutual discovery. The household felt it too. Laughter returned to the corridors, music to the drawing room. The servant spoke of how the Duchess's presence had softened the Duke's temper, and how the master's smile, rare as it was, could light the great hall like sunlight through glass. Yet, peace rarely exists without shadow. One afternoon, as Clara walked along the western terrace, she was approached by Lady Beatrice Langford, the Duke's childhood companion and one of the few who had not visited since the wedding. Beatrice was elegant, charming, and carried an air of entitlement honed by years of privilege. Her smile, though warm, did not reach her eyes. "My dear Duchess," she began, her tone honeyed, "how noble of you to care for Ashbourne after such unfortunate beginnings. Few women would endure what you have." Clara inclined her head politely. "It is my home now. One endures little when one belongs." Beatrice's brows arched. "Belonging is such a fragile thing, isn't it? Particularly when one's marriage began under less than affectionate terms." Clara met her gaze evenly. "Affection can grow where pride once stood. You know the Duke well enough to understand that." Beatrice's lips curved. "Oh, I do. I also know that men like Alexander rarely change. He may speak kindly, but his heart remains where it always was, bound to duty, not sentiment. But then," she added with a soft laugh, "perhaps you are content to live on borrowed tenderness." The words struck deeper than Clara wished to admit, yet she refused to let them show. "You are mistaken, Lady Beatrice. What stands between the Duke and me is not borrowed. It is being built, brick by brick, and it is far stronger than gossip." Beatrice's smile faltered, just enough to betray irritation. "We shall see," she murmured, and departed, leaving Clara with a faint echo of her perfume and unease in her heart. That night, the Duke found Clara in the library, her book untouched in her lap. He noticed the quiet tension in her posture, the faraway look in her eyes. "Something troubles you," he said. She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Lady Beatrice came today." His expression darkened instantly. "What did she want?" "Nothing of consequence," Clara replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "Only to remind me that I was never meant for your world." He crossed the room, stopping before her chair. "You are my world," he said quietly, "and anyone who suggests otherwise is a fool." The earnestness in his tone startled her. "Do you mean that, Alexander?" He knelt before her, the proud Duke of Ashbourne, kneeling as though before a queen. "I have made many mistakes, Clara. I married you out of duty and resentment, blind to what you are. But every day since my illness, I have seen you more clearly. You are the reason this house breathes again. You are the reason I am alive." Her breath caught. "You speak as though I am your salvation." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps you are. For years I believed myself untouchable, and it left me hollow. But you—" His hand reached for hers, tentative. "You make me wish to be a better man. Tell me, is there hope that you could ever forgive me for what I once was?" She looked into his eyes that had once held only pride and now shimmered with sincerity. Slowly, she placed her hand over his. "Forgiveness was never the question," she whispered. "It was love I doubted. And now," she faltered, her heart trembling, "now I begin to believe it might be possible." He rose, still holding her hand. "Then let me prove it, day by day, in every word and every silence." From that night onward, something irrevocable shifted between them. Their conversations grew freer, their laughter more genuine. They walked the gardens together at dusk, shared quiet dinners without formality, and on stormy nights they lingered by the fire, speaking of dreams they had once buried. Clara found herself falling in love not with the title or the estate, but with the man who had once hidden behind them, a man learning, at last, how to feel. The transformation did not go unnoticed. When Ashbourne hosted its first spring ball since their marriage, even the most cynical of guests whispered of the Duke's newfound warmth. They watched in awe as he danced with his wife beneath the great chandelier, his gaze fixed upon her as though she were the only soul in the room. "You are radiant tonight," he murmured as they turned across the marble floor. Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. "And you, my lord, are almost unrecognizable." "Then I owe that to you," he replied softly. For you have taught me what no title ever could, that love is not commanded, but earned. Later that evening, as the guests departed and the music faded, Clara stood by the window, watching the moon spill its silver light over the gardens. Alexander joined her quietly, his presence warm and sure beside her. "Do you remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the night you told me I was the last woman you would ever marry?" He smiled ruefully. "I remember every foolish word." "And now?" she asked. He stepped closer, his breath brushing her ear. "Now, you are the only woman I could ever love." Clara turned to face him, her heart full, her doubts at last laid to rest. "Then we are both redeemed," she said softly. He drew her into his arms, the world outside fading into quiet stillness. "No, my love," he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. "We are just beginning." And as dawn crept over the hills of Ashbourne, its first light spilling through the grand windows, the Duke and Duchess stood together, no longer bound by duty or pride, but by a love that had weathered pride, illness, and fear. What began as a union of circumstance had become the truest kind of devotion, one earned through patience, forgiveness, and the courage to change.